if you're just joining us, we're just waiting for everyone to get into the room and this all sync with YouTube.
Whoa. Yeah, seeing it fill up.
Hi, I'm Catherine Jean Lopez from National Review Institute, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. We're having a conversation on how to help families, conservative different approaches to how to help families, and I'm really grateful for everyone who's joining us today. Obviously, the family is foundational, and so whatever we can do in our economic policies to help them flourish, we want to have a conversation about. So without delay, Scott Winship is a resident scholar and the director of poverty studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Angela Rachidi is the Rhodes Scholar in Poverty Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Robert Stein is deputy chief economist at First Trust Advisors and his longtime contributor to National Review Online. Ramesh Ponnuru is a senior fellow at the National Review Institute and a senior editor at National Review. And our moderator today is Michael Brendan Dougherty, senior writer at National Review Online and author of the book, My Father Left Me, An American Son's Search for Ireland, for Home in Ireland. Now, I just butchered the title of your book, which means everyone has to go to Amazon. You get My Father Left Me, Ireland. I'm Catherine Lopez from the National Review Institute, and I want to thank NRI for letting us to come together and have this discussion, and for all the different events we do under the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Civil Society. And with that, Michael, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. I want to thank everyone here watching us on Zoom and on Facebook. I will not belabor long in next introduction. Cicero said, the first bond of society is marriage, next children, and then the family. But I'll throw it right to Scott because we have limited time to talk about the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit and how best to help families, especially now when the Biden administration has a new policy that we're trying out where we're going to be sending monthly checks to families, and where do we go from here? So Scott, take it away.
Great, thanks, Michael. Thrilled to be here with this great panel, folks I'm good friends with. Just want to make a couple of points, I think, in the time I've got for some initial remarks. So the first of those points, I would say supporting families obviously is a worthy goal, but it's also one that elides a lot of tensions in conservative social policy. Many conservatives want to increase the number of children born and the number of families with one worker and one parent at home. Few would endorse increasing the number of children born to single parents and the number of families with no worker and one parent at home. So supporting families by providing unconditional cash to them means potentially increasing the number of families that are dependent on government benefits rather than work, and increasing the number of children growing up without both parents present. And so we have to be really careful in designing these policies. And I would argue, in general, we want to condition them on something like work or marriage, lest it undermine the safety net and its ability to promote upward mobility for poor families. So that's been part of what we've seen the last few weeks, I think, with the intra-conservative debates over some of these policies is conservative anti-poverty scholars really coming at this from a different angle, I think, than some others. The second point I would make is that much of what we talk about when we talk about family policy involves solutions to problems that are really overstated or misunderstood. So you hear a lot of people that are in favor of family policy because they're concerned about falling birth rates, for instance. But the birth rate is low because of rising affluence, not because of increasing hardship. The big drop that occurred was in the 1970s, when women in particular experienced a lot more professional opportunities, and when couples basically chose more stuff instead of more kids. And to some extent, that's sort of a choice we've made collectively, and we're just unlikely to get back to the 1950s or 1960s if that's the goal of folks. On the eve of the pandemic, earnings and hourly wages among both men and women and household income in the middle of the distribution were higher than ever before, and poverty was lower than ever before. In new analyses that I'm doing, I compare millennial women in their mid-30s to late boomers in their mid-30s, using data sets in which both were asked at around age 20 how many kids they expected to ultimately have. I'm finding that by their mid-30s, fewer millennials had fallen short of their expectations than was the case for late boomers. And no less a good pronatalist than Lyman Stone has indicated that the reason that fertility has fallen is not because of increasing costs of raising kids. In fact, he found that relative to middle-class married couple household incomes, that cost has actually declined over time. Actually, I guess I have a third point very quickly, is that we have a huge deficit problem. And so I think whatever we advocate, we really, as conservatives, need to keep that in mind. We need to worry about deficits, and we also need to worry about the looming threat of universal basic income and all the costs that would entail as well. I'll just leave it at there for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Listen, I'm not going to ask any particular questions. Next panelist is Bob Stein. Welcome to this, and we'll start off with your remarks, and we'll come back with questions after this opening round. So Bob, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Michael. So I'd like to start out by saying that there's some level of agreement, I'm sure, with all the panelists, in that whatever we do, if we do anything on shifting the fiscal burden away from non-parents and away from parents and toward non-parents, we have to be careful with whatever we do, whether it's an allowance, whether it's a credit, and there are implications of all the details in whatever program we choose, and need to be careful. We should be in particular careful about undermining marriage, and to some extent undermining work as well. One thing that Scott mentioned is the reduction in fertility related to affluence. Just because something is due to affluence doesn't mean it's good. There are things that affluence bring that can be negative. And in particular, the free market itself and the growth related to it and the affluence related to it have raised the opportunity cost of having kids. And as a society, I don't have a problem with addressing the negative impact of free market capitalism and affluence on the propensity to raise children. It doesn't have to be related to a government program like Social Security and Medicare, which I also think deters people from raising kids, in order for fiscal policy to react and to try to offset that. I don't think the government, in other words, should be neutral about whether people raise children at all. I think the government should be pronatalist, and that affluence is by itself one of the negative influences that we need to offset.
All right, thank you very much. I realized I went out of the original assigned order, so I'm going to put Ramesh next and Angela after that. Ramesh, I'll have you pick up from there. And unmute, please.
My comments are always much more brilliant when they stay muted, but for you, I'll make an exception. I'm afraid I'm going to be contributing to a festival of agreement, although perhaps some disagreements will emerge later. Let me tackle on the child credit side, child allowance side, this question of what effect should we want government policy to have on birth rates, and how much of an effect can one reasonably expect there to be? Well, Scott suggested that there are many causes of declining birth rates that are not related to an increase in need or want, or even the costs of having children. Although I would be interested in seeing whether opportunity costs of having additional children are included in that calculation. I think we could go on and say that there are many other things that have contributed to it. You know, when child mortality rates drop, people are going to have less children to start with. That's a good thing. I think we can all agree. When we have the development of financial markets and increasing sophistication in them, there are other ways to provide for your future than particularly if you had an agrarian economy where you need more hands, including pretty young ones, working for you. And at the same time, the increasing demands of education mean that you're going to spend a longer time not producing for your family. All that's true. But I would say that there are, as Bob alluded to, there are some effects that government has itself created that have diminished the incentive to have kids. In particular, the sort of socialization of some of the returns from investing in children that have accompanied the old age entitlements, where even if you don't make the financial sacrifices entailed in raising children, you receive the benefits in your old age from other people having done so. And that is a dependence on an investment that federal policy doesn't account for currently, or at least doesn't fully account for, and it's quite a large one. And then turning away from that, to the extent that there is still a gap, even if it is narrowed, between the size of the families people want to have and the size that they end up having, and then to the extent that that gap is partly a result of economic circumstances, then I think there is something to be said for a government helping to enable people to fulfill one of these great objectives of the good life for most people, to have kids. Sometimes these discussions get sidetracked, not in this case so far at least, into this idea that the point of these so-called pronatalist policies is to bribe people to do something that they don't want to do. But in this case, it really is, I think, more to enable people to do something that they do want to do. Now, there are all kinds of trade-offs, and the details of these things matter. I could see different advantages and disadvantages to the Romney plan, the Rubio-Lee plan, and now the new Senator Hawley plan, and those are important to discuss and weigh, and lots of the considerations, for example, that Scott has raised about the effects on marriage and work, and the deficit need to be taken into account of. I think that the Romney plan is actually pretty good in spelling out its pay-fors, and the Lee and Rubio plan is one that doesn't, I think, pose a lot of dangers in terms of marriage and work. So those things are important to work out. But these trade-offs ought to be done in the context of agreement on the idea that helping families, helping parents is good. And helping work is also good, which is why I think we should also talk about the earned income credit and how maybe it might make sense to sort of separate these functions of promoting work and helping families with children.
So I want to turn to Angela, and this time I will throw out a little bit of an ask for, which is, Ramesh brought up the goal of increasing fertility, but I think, we've noticed in some countries like Poland introduced a plan to support families and increase fertility, and the effect they got was the elimination of child poverty. And that seems to be a goal that some policy thinkers here are more concerned with. I think of the Niskanen report on family policy focused on this because they thought it was more achievable. So I'd like whatever comments you have on the topic, but if you could touch on the anti-poverty side, I think that would be helpful to us too.
Yes, definitely. And thank you, Michael, and the National Review Institute for having us all here. That actually was partly the point I wanted to make. in somewhat into response, in response to what Ramesh said and the other speakers, I think that we are all in agreement that there is a role for the federal government, at least in the area of family policy. I mean, I'm generally someone who believes in limited federal government. I believe a lot of decisions are better made at the local level, but I do believe in family policy. Government has a role and has had some success in this area to some extent. My problem, though, with the kind of idea of a child allowance or expanded child tax credit is that I don't think it would actually be very effective in achieving the policy goals that have been laid out. So one is fertility. So I agree with Scott that I think sometimes the issue of fertility is overstated. But even if you agree that fertility, declining fertility is a problem, and there's almost no evidence that suggests a child allowance or an expanded child tax credit in the amounts we're talking about would have any effect at all on completed fertility. Same thing, one of the other goals that's often talked about in terms of a child allowance is kind of this idea of allowing moms to stay home and be stay-at-home moms because that's their preference. But when you look at the data, the preferences of moms, it's roughly about a quarter to a third of mothers of young children want to stay home with their children. And that almost matches identically of how many moms actually do stay home. So I don't see a huge problem with this unmet need for mothers who want to stay home with their children, but feel that they economically cannot do that. And then third, Michael, to your point about poverty, I mean, that is often, and actually those on the left, that when they talk about an expanded child tax credit and child allowance, it usually is around reducing poverty. And I just believe there's much better ways for us to reduce poverty than this type of policy, especially when you factor in the reduced employment that likely would come from this type of policy. And I don't think there's really any question about that, about the reduced employment. I mean, my AEI colleagues, Alex Brill and Kyle Ponnuru, put out a paper maybe last week and estimated using CBO assumptions about employment. And even on the low end, it was a loss of full-time equivalent jobs with the expanded child tax credit in range of about 150,000. So employment will decline, and I think that is going to harm our most vulnerable families. And some of the reduced poverty effects that people expect to happen may happen at the aggregate level, but it's going to definitely harm some of the most vulnerable families.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to go back to Scott with two things. It seems to me that for some decades, the right was generally arguing for expanded child tax credits, and the left side of the family policy debate was arguing about national daycare or childcare programs. But now we've seen the left, I think, maybe suddenly feeling like they're living in a post-scarcity world, saying we could do national daycare and we can send monthly checks to families. What is bringing about this change and the sudden even conservative interest in family policy? Is it the decline in fertility? Is it just that boomers are losing a little bit of their muscle in the American electorate and millennials are rising up? And then comment also on, I mean, we've said that when you model the effects of some of these expanded tax credits, you don't see a difference, but yet all these surveys are cited where millennials say the reason they're not getting married, the reason they're not having children is they can't afford it. Is there a reason to disbelieve them?
Sure. So let's see. Starting with the first question about why there's so much conservative interest in these policies today, I think it's a complicated question. I think it's got its roots from before 2016, I think, and before sort of the revolution that Trump has sort of inspired. The reform conservatives, of whom two of the most preeminent ones are featured on this call. I think Bob is sort of the godfather of the expanded child tax credit in a lot of ways. That was kind of a signature proposal offered by a group of conservatives who were frustrated that the center right was not offering more to middle-class families. And it really was sort of the precursor to, I think, a lot of the national conservatism that has since come and has a very different flavor to it. But the roots are sort of already there in reform conservatism, I think. Certainly the pandemic and also the sort of populism that swelled with President Trump's ascent in politics, I think has strengthened voices on the right that are more populist, pro-worker, however you define that. And that has been part of what's happened, I think. And I think third, just the pandemic moved the Overton window in a lot of ways, both on the left and the right, in terms of what kinds of things people were willing to contemplate. We spent $3 trillion in 2020, and then of course Biden's American Rescue Plan was on the order of $2 trillion. So money has become kind of monopoly money at this point, and we haven't seen any repercussions in the form of inflation or higher interest rates. And so people, I think, just generally are worrying less about spending money, and the debate has revolved more around how to spend the money that apparently is infinite. To your second question about whether we should believe people in surveys, we should definitely believe people in surveys. I think a lot of times the survey results that get cited are a little more complicated than is indicated. I think the ones you're referring to typically are along the lines of the people who said that they don't have as many kids as they would like. What are the reasons for that, right? So that's already conditioning on the group of people who have said that they're not meeting their own fertility goals. So of that group, a number of them say that it is because of concerns about the job market, student debt, the cost of living, and there's something to that. I think those questions aren't well formulated to pose trade-offs to people on the order of what would you be willing to give up in order to have a child or more children. So I think getting at the importance of economics would require digging in to those sorts of details a little bit. And it's also just hard to evaluate these things without trend estimates too. So I think a point in time result is valuable, but without knowing is that more or less than was the case 10, 30, 50 years ago, it's kind of hard to evaluate those.
Could I jump in on the employment point that we've talked about? It's funny how this is not just a discussion among conservatives, like an intramural debate to some extent among conservatives, but it's more specifically an intramural debate among people at the American Enterprise Institute, which includes 4 of your current panelists and may as well include the 5th. Now, I may be wrong about this, and you would be in a position to know, but my understanding of the estimates that our colleagues came up with on the employment effects of a child credit were very specifically directed at the Biden plan that is included in the American, what are they, some ridiculous name, American Rescue Plan. If I remember correctly, also, the effects are for 2 reasons. One is that people at the low end of the labor market get a bump up in their income if they have kids, and therefore don't need to work in order to have a certain minimum level of income. And second, the current setup of the child credit acts as a kind of negative rate tax for people who are climbing that ladder. And because the new child credit, the Biden child credit, doesn't phase in like that, you don't have that positive incentive to work. I don't know if I would think of that in terms of causing harm to families, but even leaving that aside, it is important, I think, to recognize the distinctions among these different kinds of plans. So the type of effect that we're talking about, that may be something that is more relevant to the Romney plan, but the Lee Rubio plan for an expanded credit maintains a phase-in. It's a different kind of phase-in, but it's still a phase-in. And the Hawley plan includes a work requirement. So some of those effects that you'd have where people would just not be in the labor market because they're getting money from the government, that wouldn't, I think, apply. And so I don't say this in any way to say this is not real, these are not real numbers, or they're not worth considering, but we do have to keep in mind that they do depend on the details.
Before we come around back to Scott or Angela on that, I know Bob has something he wants to chime in with right here. So Bob.
Thank you, Michael. So a couple of thoughts on the survey data. I take the survey information with a little bit of a grain of salt. And the reason is I don't think they have quite enough texture to tell you what's going on in people's minds. For example, they'll ask a question about how many kids do you want, and does this fulfill, what you want it to do? What they really need to get at is how much more after-tax income might it take in order for you to have an additional child over and above what you currently have or would currently want? Because I took my own survey about 13 years ago or 14 years ago. Honey, we have 2 kids. Do you want another? And the answer was no. And I said, well, what if we throw in a nanny 30 hours a week? Oh, the answer is yes. So there was a price point. And I think the survey data that a lot of us are taking our information from don't necessarily give you that texture. The other thing is, I think Michael's question a while ago was about, what's going on with the Democratic side. They seem to have gone from child care credits to a policy of both. And what I think is going on is they still want to feed the child care credit to the American public because that pays a constituency that supports them. And so they're never not going to want more subsidies to relatively low-income service workers. I mean, those are their people. But they also realize that it polls really poorly, and that if it's set up between a child care credit and a credit for all parents, the all-parent credit's going to win. And people don't care about the deficit because the interest burden generated by the deficit right now is pretty low. So in the end, people are going to support. There's going to be more support for the universal child credit than the child care credit itself, apart from the policy implications and apart from which one is right. I mean, obviously we have differences of opinion here, but that's, I think, what's going on.
So I want to ask, and I'd love Angela to jump in here. I mean, the recent innovation, I guess, on the right is Romney's proposal of an allowance, right? And maybe it's an innovation on the left as well. What are the benefits and dangers of that approach? I mean, Scott has argued in other forums about the work discouragement that if people receive a benefit apart from work that sustains them, then the habit of work will disappear from the home, which is bad for both the parent and the child, right? It kind of encourages an antisocial orientation toward the world. Is that a danger of the Romney plan in particular, or all plans like it? Have the defenders of that plan successfully defended it from that attack? What do you think?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And this actually speaks to Ramesh's point about the different plans. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I'm not sure you would see the same debate within AEI if we were talking about the Lee Rubio plan. The Hawley plan would probably be a totally different debate, but to directly answer your question, the issue is really about the refundability and the full refundability for people that have no earnings in the household. And so for people like me, who my background is working in the welfare system and working with the TANF program, so non-working single mothers coming to a government agency to get assistance. And I started working in New York City in the welfare system in the early 2000s, right around the time of welfare reform. And there was just this huge push at the time to increase employment among single mothers, because it was very clear the harmful effects that not working and the not having the income that comes from work was having, not only on the mothers, but on the children as well. So I think that's my background. And so when I hear about policies that are trying to reinstate kind of government aid to non-working single mothers, mostly, it does start to make me very uncomfortable. And it feels like we're going back to a time that many people maybe don't remember, because I think, to the point about why has this become more popular, I think people forget what it was like 20, 25 years ago, when we had 40% of never married mothers were employed. And we had very high child poverty rates. And so we're not in that place now. And so I think that the main concern, again, is about the refundability. And from my perspective, at least, it is about the disemployment effects, and how a lack of employment in these very vulnerable households would cause long-term harm.
So is there a way, I mean, I see that, other kind of policy entrepreneurs on the right, like Orrin Cass, have tried to kind of split the baby on this one, right? To come up with an allowance that curves up in such a way that it doesn't present the work disincentives of that maybe in Romney's plan. Is that a possibility? Does that seem like a fruitful possibility for kind of maybe even uniting around a policy? Or do we expect to be in this idea stage where we're getting Rubio, Lee, Romney, Hawley all introducing kind of separate, totally different visions? Or can we start to envision what a policy that maybe the broader right, or at least its intellectuals, can get behind? Is there a way of cutting through? Anyone?
So I think, I think that we're sort of inevitably going to have this debate that's happening right now, and the sort of let's be optimistic and call it intellectual ferment around these sorts of proposals. I think it's quite important because you hear on the left a lot of confidence about making some of the Biden policies, and particularly this child credit that's really sort of an allowance, permanent. I don't think that can happen, actually, unless there is some significant buy-in on the right. And whether that happens and the terms on which it would happen, I think will depend on the outcome of debates like this one. And so, maybe it ends up being something like a child allowance, but with a work requirement, for example, or maybe there is some phase in, but it's a more generous phase in than the one we have. That's my sort of snapshot of this debate. Now, of course, if it turns out that a consensus just can't be achieved around making some more generous pro-child policy permanent, then the issue is just preserved and we continue arguing about it, and then maybe we move on it in 2025 or something. But I do think that there is some medium-term prospect of movement on this, and I think that actually the people who are, not to necessarily speak for Scott and Angela, but I think their concern, right, is that this would be made into a permanent policy more or less on its current trajectory, or maybe melded with the Romney plan and not adapted at all.
Right. Can we just visually get a kind of cue from all the panelists? Do you think the current Biden plan that's phasing in this year is going to be more or less permanent, and we're just going to get trade-offs on the details? Or do you think we'll have a significant change to it? Or just we'll go around quick?
I think it's likely that it becomes permanent. I think they have to get all the Democrats lined up, and then Vice President Harris becoming the 51st vote, and they've got as many reconciliation bills as they want. So there's a matter of pay fors, I think, but otherwise, I think it's likely to happen.
Okay, Bob?
I'm leaning toward, but only leaning toward it becoming permanent. I'm not completely sold. Here we're not saying what we want to happen, we're saying what we think will happen, whether we like it or not. And I would say maybe 60% to 65% that it becomes permanent. I could see it lapsing if, for example, Manchin insists on a bipartisan bill and the parties can't have a meeting of the minds for some reason. we could go 1 or 2 years without, and then we could revisit in 2025.
Okay, and Angela, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think it's likely to become permanent. I don't think, though, I don't expect any Republicans to support it, but I do think it'll become permanent.
So what would then what would we make, okay, if we're expecting that something like, you know, what is it, 3,600 a year for children under 6 and 3,000 a year for children between 6 and 18 in monthly payments, if something like that is becoming permanent, what do we make of attempts to play with the other incentives in the family formation question, right? Which is what I see Senator Hawley doing with his parent tax credit idea, which is basically, okay, if you're a single mom, you're gonna get this kind of a benefit tax credit, so big, but if you are married, it's going to be double that. Like, and you know, this is an amount of money that is, you know, seems serious, especially considering, you know, there is a significantly more people in a cohabiting household now, where that kind of money may make a difference. I mean, it might literally be the wedding budget in some cases. So what do we think about that? Is there still work for conservatives to do on those incentives of marriage and job and those kind of pro-social markers that are good for the people that are involved in them, and also good for their children?
So personally, I think there's things to like in the Hawley proposal and things not to like. I think what's interesting is if it were a replacement for the child tax credit, I think it's got some really attractive features. The marriage bonus is a big one. I think as much as the left, you know, won't like giving married couples twice as much as single parents, the benefit to single parents is as generous relative to what the CTC and ACTC was last year, as the Biden expansion of the CTC is for lower income people. So it's in some sense just as generous to folks lower down, even though it gives a lot more to married parents. I think it's too much. I think it's, you know, it's $12,000, especially if it's on top of the CTC. You know, a couple making $200,000 that has 3 kids doesn't need $20,000 a year to subsidize their child rearing. So that would be the objection there. But I think I view it less as a contender among the other plans that we've been talking about, and more as something that's quite different, and it maybe ought to be a contender among those 4. But it seems like it's being talked about as by the Hawley folks is something that would go on top of everything else.
Okay.
If the Hawley plan were introduced as a substitute, which again, as Scott is saying, it's not being presented as a substitute, it's being presented as an add-on, then I think it would raise a concern, which is that you know, a lot of those of us who are who've been interested in more support for parents have thought in terms of making it possible for people to have more children, offsetting certain indirect effects of government that reduce that incentive and so forth. Now, and as I understand it, the Hawley plan doesn't have that kind of marginal effect, because if you are a household with 1 child or a household with 3 children, you're getting the exact same amount of money under that plan. So it's really, I think, best thought of as a marriage bonus for parents, rather than a reward or help for having kids and raising kids. And you know, as Scott said, maybe you should sort of think of it in those terms and debate it in those terms.
Can I also throw out more, you know, and Bob and Angela, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. You know, when we're structuring these programs, right, there are these, even in the Biden plan, there is a cutoff for Americans with like outstanding household incomes. You know, what is it, 400,000 on the current plan is when it really starts to taper out. You know, should middle-class families get this at all? I mean, I think for those that are attacking family policy primarily as a a fertility inducement, right? It is, they're looking at it as like, okay, we want these middle class families that are kind of, maybe they're younger, they're not as deep into their high powered earning years as they expect to be. So this is a kind of way of smoothing their income and allowing them to have that one extra child. And that extra child is going to be born into a stable family. And that's going to be good, even though it looks like a handout to the middle class. Whereas I think we're seeing around the world, we're not seeing like the large effects on fertility from other countries that spend significantly more of their GDP on family policy, but you are seeing like the effect on child poverty. And maybe, I mean, in some countries, I think the effect is more trying to stop emigration, which is not our problem at all in the United States. Not yet anyway, hopefully. So like, how do we hash out where these cutoffs should be and how much is enough, right? Where in a sense you have to tell a middle-class family like, hey, maybe think about cutting back a vacation or cutting back on other things to pay for your family, right? That you have to have some revealed preference here. There has to be a choice for the family.
Well, Michael, this kind of speaks to my broader point about how effective would an extra $1,000 or whatever per kid really be? I mean, if we're talking about trying to incentivize middle-class families to have more children, I just don't see how this policy really has any effect on that calculation at all. Maybe as part of a much bigger plan, but I don't see this even leading to something that would have an effect on fertility. And so I think that the Biden plan actually phases out after $150,000 for married families. The Romney plan went up to $400,000, which is what the child tax credit currently is, but the expansion phases out. So the higher income families still get the $2,000 or whatever per child. But yeah, just a broader point, because you had made the point that middle-class families will feel like, oh, this is going to allow me to have more kids. I really question that assumption. Is it really? I mean, is an extra $1,600 a year going to be the thing that millennial says, oh yes, now we can afford to have more kids? I'm very skeptical.
And or is it enough that like, a family like mine where we have 2 incomes and 3 children says, oh, maybe we could be 1 income plus the handout and 4 children. I don't personally in our household, I don't think it would add up, but I'm not sure if that's true for other couples in different states.
This is all Bob trying to afford a nanny, essentially.
Well, but that is like one of the
state would a nanny cost that.
But that is actually one of the I think the features that I think has somewhat broad support right and left is if you put at least undirected money into the hands of parents, they're going to be able to make their own decision based on their own family situation. And that for some people, a full-time professional nanny would be totally out of reach, but throwing a little extra money to grandma, or something like that, if she spends time 10 hours a week helping out or something like that, or a cousin or a sister-in-law, those do make differences to people and maybe do make them feel like they have power. And I think it also, at least is one of the benefits of the rights approach so far, is that every household has a slightly different set of incentives pulling on them that can't be addressed just by a national daycare program.
In terms of the phase outs that you had mentioned earlier, I'm kind of conflicted. I don't think that, on the one side, making it universal will not cost you a lot of money if you're already paying everybody up to say 150,000 and 300 or whatever it is. Okay, 100,000, 200, 204. Going all the way, making it universal doesn't cost you at the margin that much more money. The problem is that it's probably not going to make that much of a difference. If you're earning 400,000 a year, as a married couple, then getting an additional couple thousand a year is almost certainly not going to make a difference in terms of whether or not you have an additional kid. We might want to go with that group in a different route, which is maybe making the estate tax more of a distribution tax or inheritance tax, and allowing more of an exemption amount if you have more kids. So if you leave, I don't know, whatever the amounts are to more children. If you have 8 kids rather than 2 kids, well, you get to leave more money tax free, because you do really want society benefits when rich people have more kids. I mean, I don't hold a brief for the Kennedy family, but having lots of kids was good because more people get to marry up and get to socialize into more upscale families. And that's a good thing. That's how, to some extent, people assimilate. Unless you're marrying the Kardashians, in which case it might be negative assimilation, but that's a different story. But generally, you want rich people to have more kids. I just don't think that the credit or the allowance is designed to encourage very upscale people to have more kids. So some sort of cutoff is perfectly fine, I think.
Ramesh, where do
sure.
you see the Republican conference on this? Because I've seen, it feels like the allowance ideas on the right, have a constituency of maybe 3 or 4 senators, maybe, like that we have more intellectuals at AEI or, some of the newer magazines and outfits out there than we have senators that are actually supportive of this. Is that likely to change at any time soon, or is the Republican conference really going to get involved in the nitty gritty of designing family policy, or is this this salon kind of all it's going to be for the right?
Well, I did think it was interesting. Let me just double check. Yes, I am unmuted. Back in December of 2017, we had a test vote of sorts in the Senate when Lee and Rubio tried to expand the child tax credit within the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And in return, they were going to bop up the corporate tax rate by 1 point or so. That is, take back a slight amount of the tax cut in corporate rates. And that effort failed. If I remember correctly, it was something like a 72-27 vote, because all the Democrats basically decided even if they preferred this policy, they would rather keep the bill as bad from their perspective as they could to accentuate the differences. But the interesting thing on the Republican side was that the division among the people who voted for it and against it, it was not predictable on regional lines or who's more establishment and who's more conservative and who's more Trumpy and who's less Trumpy. It really was just the younger Republican senators were for it, and the older ones were against it in general, with a few exceptions, which I thought was really interesting and maybe a sign that there's a little bit of a generational shift, and partly it is maybe the old line Republican belief that everything in tax policy that matters is getting the top income tax rate as low as possible, that has less of a hold among younger Republicans. And so I would say that there is some potential for maybe not the allowance itself, but for something along the lines of what we've been discussing to get some more support from Republicans.
I think that vote would be completely different today. If in the 4 intervening years, I could imagine people sitting from the Republican side talking about all the woke corporations that the Kudlow and Moore folks, with their tax cuts for people who hate the GOP, would be protecting. And we're protecting parents on the other side. So I don't think it would be 72-28 or whatever the vote was back then. I think the Republican caucus, I think the vast majority of the Republican caucus would vote today on that same bill for a higher corporate rate and a higher child credit.
Well, and I would just add, I mean, I think that the willingness to use tax expenditures is very different now than it was 4 years ago. And so if I remember that debate correctly, it was the unwillingness to expand the refundability of the credit because it's a tax expenditure. And that was kind of the Rand Paul sort of argument. And I think you're all right that probably has very much changed the last 4 years. There's just more willingness to spend. And that's been a trend for the last several years.
Just one more point on this. The ground of the debate is different, right? So back then, the loudest voice against an expanded child credit was the Wall Street Journal editorial page and associated ones like people like our friend Larry Kudlow. And the argument wasn't this could have some bad effects on work or, maybe we need to make sure that there aren't any unintended side effects on incentives to marry a wage earner or something like that. It is wrong in principle to help parents because the tax code is not for that. And the point of the tax code is to be as pure and as close to a flat tax as possible. And that's just really so far kind of fallen out of the debate. And it seems to be kind of a relic of kind of Randian man, not just Rand Paul, that sort of the Republican Party has to some extent left behind.
So
It's hard to.
Oh, go ahead, Scott.
I was just gonna say it is hard to know. I was asked by a reporter in the last week or two, what other Republican senators were likely to become involved in the debate, and we're talking about four personalities here essentially. Maybe Cotton will come out with something to keep his 2024 prospects strong, but it's just not clear that many Republican senators or members of the House are thinking about this stuff at all. Even Senator Lee, who I recently worked for, his position has maybe changed at the margin, but he still, to my knowledge, only favors expanding the CTC, the refundable part of it anyway, up to payroll tax liability. And that's a pretty hard line for him. I think that's true for Senator Rubio. I'm obviously less familiar with his office, but so it may be that we're still really just talking about something that I think, Michael, as you said earlier, has a lot of fans in the center right think tank world, but maybe doesn't really have a lot among policymakers right now.
Well, I'm wondering before we're supposed to close out at 3:30. So before we do that, do you think that family policy concerns or fertility concerns are going to leak out beyond the tax code debates or even the child allowance debates? We're already seeing, of course, like in the 2020 COVID year, there's already estimates that there's going to be 300 to 500,000 fewer babies born than you would have expected. So we may see another dramatic like drop in American fertility. And millennials are just getting older. Their fertility window is starting to close, and they're I think the biggest generational power that's involved in this debate. Are we going to see this leak out into cost of living debates about housing or about zoning even or whatever? I mean, Orrin Cass has kind of come up with this cost of living style of looking at it, which has some critics here on the phone call. But I think that also, if these concerns become more general, or even if there's a kind of moral panic about the disappearing future, we could see people trying to rope in non-parents by saying, well, let's try to lower the cost of living in a general way that would help parents. Is that a new frontier that we expect to see, or is that going to be cordoned off in its own cabin?
Well, I'm curious what the others think, but I feel like it's already leaked out into other debates. I mean, I've heard debates around fertility and more around just the making it more affordable to get married and have a family in college debt debates, zoning debates, school choice debates. I mean, all of these policy debates, I feel like has a little bit a piece around just the trying to use government policy to make it easier to have a family.
Right, which in many cases amounts to, or should amount to, getting rid of obstacles that the government has created. And I do think it's a natural fit in some of these cases. The problem of overregulation in housing markets around the country has all kinds of side effects. And one of them, I think, is that it impedes family formation, or at least it makes it harder. It makes it harder to afford having a bigger household, and it makes it particularly harder to afford that in places where the good jobs are or where the opportunities are beckoning. And so I think it ought to be part of a pro-family agenda. And I think there's enough, there are enough policy areas that I think it really should be thought of. There should be thought of as a pro-parent agenda that's waiting to be worked out and seized on by some policy or political entrepreneur.
I totally agree, and sign me up for that family policy agenda. Rather than sort of the tax credit approach. I think there's a cost of that. So obviously, I'm not a fan of
both and Scott. Both and
cost of thriving index, which the less I say about that here, the better. But I think it's absolutely the case that a cost of living agenda, would be pro-family and would be conservative. The extent to which government involvement in housing, healthcare, and higher ed, the 3 H's, has inflated those costs is substantial, and those are not insignificant pieces of the budget for families with kids.
I worry just on the cost of housing part that we're about to set homeowning parents against non-homeowning parents, right? That the real driver in many places of housing costs is the existing stock of homeowners who want to retain their value, or like their retirement is even premised on the value of their home going up, or at least staying on par as they pay off that mortgage. Anyway, I want to turn to Bob before we have to close out.
Oh,
It just looked like you had something to say. So.
Oh yeah, I was thinking in terms of how, the amount of supply of housing at the lower price points is amazingly low. The inventory is not there, and it's a troublesome thing because people at lower income groups who have kids have trouble finding a safe neighborhood for their kids to grow up in, and so that's definitely something we'd like to address, or we should address. The other thing to think about in terms of higher ed, I think that is a problem. You have to remember that there are a lot of academics, both administrators and professors, who do get to raise families because I see the school loans as a transfer scheme, using students as mules to haul money, to professors and academics. So it's a problem for the kids who graduate with the debt, but not the people on the other side.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's a college near me that recruits students out of, say, like the food service industry that are making low 5 figures, and it transmutes their student loans into 6-figure salaries, and then the students go right back to food service at the end of their education. It's pretty much a total scam. It's a total scam, and all those people should go to jail in my book. But
they do get to learn some critical theory in between.
Well, listen. Yes. Well, listen. If I could sum up, because I want to respect people's time, and we're about a minute away from when we have to go. I mean, it does seem like there is this variety of approaches, whether expanding credits, but there seems to be, at least among our panel, and I think more broadly, broad agreement about the challenges. Right. That if you go to an allowance, you have a challenge on, and you have to watch very carefully about whether that is discouraging work. And I think also that there's this, we have agreement that there is this broader cost of living agenda that might even be more fruitful, both because it doesn't violate our principles to begin addressing it, and because it probably has an even larger constituency than just millennials who answer surveys about that one extra child they're not having. So I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank National Review Institute for hosting this. I'd like to thank everyone that's watching on Facebook and on Zoom. We're really honored to have you. You're a huge part of National Review and our mission, and we honestly couldn't do it without you. You know, I think in the last couple of years, the National Review Institute and National Review have kind of pioneered a new way of supporting National Review's mission. And so my thanks to all of you and to all our panelists and my colleagues for putting this event together. I don't know if Catherine has a last message, but I will call it quits up from here in Westchester, where I'm awaiting the salt cap repeal. Anyway, is that it? All right.